Kol, this is on the very top of Daf Lamed Daled Amud Beis. Kol shepsula begufo yisarif miyad. If you have a carbon that became puzzle, for example, it became nosar, or maybe it was yotza chutz miluchutzaso, and therefore became yotze or pigul or tame, any different psulim, and we're not going to wait around. We're going to burn it immediately. What is the case that we discussed earlier, where we're not ready to burn it until we leave it overnight in this guma that was in the kevet, between the kevesh and the mizbeach? That's a case of badam ubebayl. Okay. Now let's understand that all of Kodshim really divides up into two parts. There's the dam, which is the avodas hamizbeach, and then there's the basar. Now, if the basar contracted tumor or became nosar or pigul, then for sure we're going to burn it immediately. But what do we do in a case where the dam, let's say, for example, fell on the azara, on the ritzpas azara? In such a case, the basar was not affected. It wasn't pigul, it wasn't nosar, it wasn't tamei, nothing. So although without this dam, the carbon will in effect become possible, and therefore the basar cannot be used as akrova aktor al gabi mizbeach, but nevertheless, at this point, the basar in and of itself is tar. It's not tamei. There's no psul in the basar. Or, for example, b'bailov. Let's say the bailim contracted tumor, but the basar itself is still tar. In such a case, we say that to ubar tsurasam, and we throw it into this open area, and we wait for it to become possible billina videos, and only then tomorrow is we take it out to the base hasreifa. Now Rashi gives an example here, b'bailim, of carbon pesach, and I'm not exactly sure why Rashi gives that example. I mean, in truth, it could be any case of a bailim that contracted tumor. In fact, in all shlamim, the bailim eat from the carbon unless they contract tumor. Rashi gives another example of mesu liachar zrika sadam, that the bailim died after the zrika. And in such a case, what happens is the basar per se is kosher, but the carbon is not a valid carbon. So in such a case, since it's in this middle of the road state, what we're going to do is we're going to put it into this lul, and to ubar tsurasa we wait till tomorrow after the psul of lina, and then we burn. So now we are back to our question, our objection, which was raised by Rabbi Yochanan against Reish Lakish. If Hesech Hadas is a psul unto itself, then why do we wait till tomorrow to ubar tsurasam? Why not just burn it immediately? And Reish Lakish answers, Amalei, Hai Tana, the Tana of this brisa, in the name of Rabbi Shmuel ben Oshel, Rabbi Yochanan Broka, who says that they had this lul for the psulei chatosov, Tana debei Rabba Baravuahu. He was from the base medrash of Rabba Baravua. The Amar afilu pigul ton ibur tsurasa. Even in a case of a psul aguf, an absolute definite psul, like pigul, which means either the kohen had a machshav shelo lizmanam or shelo bimkomon, chutz lizmanam, chutz bimkomon. Even in such a case, we're not going to burn it immediately, and we're going to wait till tomorrow with a psul of lina, of to ubar tsurasa. Now, exactly why Rabba was of the opinion, had he derived the conclusion that we don't burn pigul immediately, we wait till tomorrow after it becomes lina, after the psul of lina, that's a sugya later on in Masechet Pesachim Adaf Pei Gimel. Ace for a second onslaught of Rabbi Yochanan against Reish Lakish from a brisa. And now we're talking about a case of a carbon after shechita before the zrika. Nitma, the basar became tameh, or nifsal basar, or the basar became pasul. And the Gemara is going to say what kind of psul does this brisa have in mind? Oh, yatsa chutz lekloim. Let's say in Kachim Kachim, if you take the Kodesh outside of the Azara, it becomes a psul of Yotze. And now, Rabbosai, we are about to learn one of, if not the most fundamental debates amongst Tanoim in all of Kachim. What's the story with a carbon when the basar itself becomes pasul, whether it's a psul of Tuma, a psul of Yotze, and he hasn't yet done the zrika. It's after the shechita. Do we go ahead with such a carbon? I mean, after all, the zrika is going to be matir the basar in general in Kodshim, but here in this case, it can't be matir the basar. The basar is tameh. It's possible. So Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yizrok. Rabbi Eliezer says that carbon could exist and it would generate kapara on behalf of the bailim, even in the absence of the basar. The basar and its haktar al gabi esham mizbeach is, in a sense, a separate entity from the carbon itself. It's the extended avoda of the carbon, but it's not the critical avoda of the carbon, which culminates with zrika. And in fact, halacha is that if after zrika sadam the basar gets lost or gets tummy, etc., the carbon is still a carbon kosher. So now we are before the zrika. We know that after the zrika, it's definitely become kosher. Says Rabbi Eliezer, let's go ahead with the zrika. The carbon will be kosher. We will not be zorik the dam of a carbon when there's no possibility of that dam being matir the basar, so that we can bring the basar and be matir it on the Eishan Gabi Mizbech. Rabbi Yeshua is not denying that if we would allow the Kohen to go ahead with the zrika, the carbon would be kosher. But we're not going to allow him to go ahead and do the zrika. Mod Rabbi Yeshua she'im zarak, if let's say for some reason the Kohen didn't pay attention to our mandate and he went ahead and he was zarik the dam, urza, the carbon is kosher and is ritzu. Now, you recall that the Brisa had a very ambiguous phrase over here. It says, Nitma o nifsal habasa. Now, once you have Nitma, and then he has Yotze, we have the Psulim. What is he adding here by using the word nifsal? What category of Psul are we dealing with? You know, if you were talking about Pigel, it would have said Pigel, no such should have said Pigel, no sar. So what's this amorphous, ambiguous term, nifsal? My love, the Gemara thinks, nifsal means what? Behesech hadas. What other psul could there be? And you'll ask me, why is it that b'di'eved, if even according to Rabbi Yeshua, the Kohen went ahead and he was zark the dam, hurtza, the carbon is kosher. I understand in the case of Tuma, why the carbon is kosher. If the Kohen Gadol is wearing the tzitz, so that removes the psul of Tuma, that's called ritzit tzitz. And we're going to apply that also in the case of nifsal, which is hesech hadas. Why? Because hesech hadas, according to Rabbi Yochanan, is only possible because of Tuma. But according to you, Reish Lakish, then a psul aguf havi. My hurts at tzitz. Tzitz is maratz al tuma, but not on psulim. The tzitz, which, with all the respect to its magical powers, could not take something that's possible and make it kosher. So how do we understand this brisa according to Reish Lakish, who holds that the whole category of psul hesek hadas is a brand new category unto itself? It's a psul aguf. So Reish Lakish answers, my nifsal, no, I have a different interpretation of nifsal. She nifsal b'tful yom, right? Tful yom is a person who contracted tumah, and on the last day of his tumah, he went into the mikvah, but he needs harif shemesh. We have to wait to allow him to eat kodshim. His tumah is still lingering on. There's a vestige of tumah until the harif shemesh. And now the tful yom came in contact with the basar. Noga tful yom babasar. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, tful yom, as far as kodshim is concerned, he's still tameh. Ihachi hainu tameh. I mean, why did the Bryce say nitma o nifsa? If you're talking about mamish tumah, I mean, according to Rabbi Yochanan, it's very good because nifsal means hesek hadas, and that's a brand new category of tumah where we're choshesh for tumah. But according to you, Reish Lakish, the only way you can interpret the word nifsal here is nifsal b'tful yom. Well, that's tameh. And the Gemara answers trei gavnei tameh. There are two categories of tumah. There's tumah gemura. Let's say a person is a tameh mess, and then he comes in contact with the kodshim. And then we have this tful yom, who already is well on the way in the process of Tara. He has purified himself. He went to the mikvah, and he's tameh. But for kodshim, he's tameh. So that's another category of tumah. But basically, nitma nifsal means this kind of tumah, which is tumah gemura, and this kind of tumah, which is tumah of a tful yom. Now, we had a long digression here, and we studied this machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish about the psul of hesek hadas. And all this was brought in sort of through the back door when we were talking about the Mishnah Trumas. You remember Silei Truma Shenitmu, and then he planted them. It was Truma Tmeya, and they were Torah Minatame, but yet they were Asal Achila. And we said that the Chiddush of the Mishnah is that they're Asal Achila even for Kohanim because they became puzzle with the psul of Hesech Hadas. And this psul of Hesech Hadas applies to both Truma and Kodshim. And it all depends, can we accept that interpretation of Rav Sheshis in the Mishnah in Trumas? Depends on this machlokas about how to understand Hesech Hadas. And if we understand that Hesech Hadas is a psul tumah, then we don't understand the Mishnah, because the Mishnah says that once you plant the saplings, it's tahorim militame. So we're going to have to assume, like Reish Lakish, that it's a separate psul aguf. So the Gemara now is stuck with the problem that if you hold like Rabbi Yochanan, that Hesech Hadas is a psul tumah, how could it possibly apply to Silei Truma? And the Mishnah says Asurim, which we said was Asurim L'Kohanim, and the Truma now becomes Truma Psula because of Hesech Hadas, when according to Rabbi Yochanan, the whole Psul of Hesech Hadas because of Chash Tumah. And here we're talking about Truma that was planted in the ground. It's Mechubel Karka. It's Tahar, as the Brisa says explicitly. How do we understand that it's also to Kohen. So the Gemara now offers an alternative interpretation of the Mishnah. Kisolik Ravin. Ravin came from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. Amra l'shmaite kamei de Rabbi Yirmiyah. He presented the sugya to Rabbi Yirmiyah with the interpretation of Rav Sheshes to the Mishnah that generates an Iser on the Kohanim in the case of Shsilei Truma Shenitma. And it's a psul of, as Rav Sheshes said, of Hesech Hadas. Rabbi Yirmiyah was not a happy camper. So they brought this Shmuah from Bavel. Now, the Israelis sometimes are big shots. Haltafzich, they hold it themselves. So Rabbi Yirmiyah responds, the Omar Bavloi Tipshoy, you foolish Babylonians. Bishum the Yasvi the Ari the Chashocha, my Bavel was low down and it was very dark. Is Amrisa Shmaita de Machashka. You give us interpretations that are dark, meaning that are far from true. You don't really know the pshat in the Mishnah. What is the true pshat in the Mishnah of Shsilei Truma, Shenitmu? Lo Shmielachu, you never heard, the Rav Shimon Lakish, which made the Rav Oshaya. What was the interpretation of Rabbi Oshaya? Me'achag, right? There's one festival during the entire year where we take mayim and we pour it on the mizbeach. That's Chag HaSukkos. That's called Nisuch HaMayim. Shenitmu. And now these waters that we want to pour on the mizbeach contracted tumah, and that passes them for Nisuch HaMayim. However, if, let's say, the Kohanim are about to do the Nisuch HaMayim, they are in the Azara, right near the Mizbeach, and lo and behold, the Mayim that they had taken from the Mei Shiloach, if you recall, which was a Mayan outside Yerushalayim, and that was used for the Nisuch HaMayim, it became Tameh. So, l'chora, the only option that we would think of is schlep all the way back to Mei Shiloach to replace this Mayim. That's a big effort. So Rav Yoshaya presents an alternative solution to the problem, and that's called hashaka. Now again, the concept of hashaka, Rabosai, requires a great deal of study. You yourselves may have done hashaka once in your life, possibly. Like when you take kalim to the mikvah, so certain kalim have a very narrow opening. Like, for example, a salt shaker. And we have salt shakers that are made of glass and metal. They require tefillah if they were manufactured in chutzos. So we do something called hashaka. Hashaka means that you submerge it into the mei mikvah, and when the mei mikvah reaches the level of the top of this kli and sort of touches or hovers over the top, then it's tah. It's as if you had submerged the entire kli inside and outside, the inside of the kli and the outside of the kli into the mikvah. So that's called hashaka. So what do we do with this mayim that was taken and designated for Nisuch HaMayim, but now contracted tumah? We're not going to have to schlep out and replace it. Right here, there was an emas mayim, there was a canal of water that went through the Azara, and there we can do hashaka. Meichag shenitmu, he shikon. We connect them to this amas mayim in the Azara, and we do hashaka, and that could be mutayr then. Comes along Rav Ochia, and he says, wait a minute, you can't just, in all circumstances, without any conditions, without any strings attached, as we would say, do this process of hashaka and pour the mayim onto the mizbeach. It all depends. If he's shikon, the achakach hikdishon, if you subjected the mayim to a process of para, so he's shikon for our perspective now, for our purposes, means he put it into a mikvah and he was mitayr them. And then he was magdish the mayim for nisuch. That's okay. Meaning, in the state of chulin, before he was magdish it went through tuma and then it was purified through tara. That's fine. Then go ahead and use that mayim for nisuch. However, hikdishon, if the mayim were already sanctified through a Maisa Kiddush, we'll see there are two possibilities of Kiddush, either in a Klichares or Bepeh, with a verbal declaration. In any event, if you are Magdish this Mayim Lenisa, the Achakachi Shikon, and then you Matar them, man, we're not going to allow recognition of the process of para, Shashaka in this case, if they're already Mayim Mekudash. This defies logic. I mean, what difference does it make whether the Kiddush took place before the Hashaka or after the Hashaka? If the Hashaka is meaningful and it accomplishes our goal of being Mitayr the Mayim and remove its Toma, then even in a case where he did the Hashaka after Kiddush HaMayim, it still should be kosher l'mizbeach. Mali shikon achakach v'akach ikdisha, mali ikdisha v'akach shikon. Alma, says the Gemara, do you know why the Hashaka doesn't work after Kiddush? That's because Ein Zriya Lehegdesh. Now, in order to appreciate Ein Zriya Lehegdesh, we have to formulate a principle called Mila B'Kodshim. There are many, many Milas B'Kodshim that reflect the fact that Kodshim are in a category of their own. They're much more Chamur. I mean, we gave a few examples. You may recall in the first parak of Pesachim, we said that Kodshim become Tmeim, even B'Revi, that's only B'Kodshim. Or, for example, there were Ochlei Kodshim. I mean, with regard to Kodshim, we have a special mitzvah of Mishmeres Kedusha. We have to make sure that it doesn't contract Tumah. So one of the various categories or manifestations of Maila B'Kodshim is Ein Zriya B'Kodshim. Now, this phrase Ein Zriya B'Kodshim cannot be taken literally. We're not talking about planting Kodshim. It should be taken figuratively to refer to Hashaka, right? Because what happens to Hashaka is that you put it inside the mikvah. It's kind of like planting, where you take a seed and you plant it in the ground. Once something has the status of Kodshim, we already have Maila B'Kodshim, and we're not going to be Mitayr it if it became Tomei through Hashaka. And that again is to instill that awe and reverence of Kodshim. Is Hachanami now says Rabbi Yirmiyah, based on Rav Oshia, we have a new interpretation of the Mishnah of Shesile Truma, because Truma, like Kodshim, has a Maila. And Hachanami ain't Zriya B'Truma, that once the Truma has Kedusha, you are mafresh it, and it has Kedusha's Truma, then if it becomes Tameh, we will not allow you to do this Hashaka and subject the Truma to this process of Tara. That's again a Maila that we saw in Kodshim, and it applies equally to Truma. So therefore, the Mishnah in Shesile Truma Shenitmu it also has the status of Mila. And on the one hand, as a result of the fact that you planted these stalks of wheat, of Truma, Tmeah, into the ground, it loses its status of Tumah. It cannot be Matame anything else. But the other hand, we're going to say it's Asur B'Achila even for Kohanim, because the Chachamim are going to extend a Mila, that we should not have any sort of Zriya, which means in this case, literally planting it to remove the status of Tumah. Does the planting remove the status of Tumah? A gigantic yes. Y-E-S. But as far as Truma is concerned, we're not going to allow, we're going to consider it as if it were a Truma Tmeah, because ain's real a Truma, because the Mila of Truma. Yosef Rav Dimi v'kamelei lo shmaitita. Rav Dimi was presenting this halacha that the Chachamim did this Mila with the water of Nisach HaMayim on Chag HaSukkos, in a case where they were magdish the Mayim, and then they wanted to, after the contract Tumah, they wanted to subject it to Shashaka, and they wouldn't allow Ashaka to take place. Amalei Abaye says to Rav Dimi, what is the word Hikdishan mean in the language, in the statement of Rav Oshia? Does it mean Hikdishan B'Kli Kamar? And I'm going to skip a little bit. Odilma B'Peh. There are two types of Kiddush. And Rav Oshia did not specify which type of Kiddush. There's something called Kiddush B'Kli, and there's something called Kiddush B'Peh. Kiddush B'Kli means when you put something in a Kli Shares, and limits vaso, because the Kli is now going to facilitate the mitzvah that you have to, it's not that you threw an apple into a Kli Shares, right? In any event, that's Mekadesh, what's called Kedushas HaGuf, Limizbeach. That's the highest level of Kedusha. Then we have a lower level of Kiddush, which is called Kiddush B'Peh, when you make a declaration that this should be Kadosh. And the difference is that Kiddush B'Peh only generates what's called Kedushas Damim, not Kedushas HaGuf, a lower level of Kiddush. For example, Nafkamina about Pidyon. Maybe Nafkamina is about Me'ilah, but Pidyon means, can you be Podeh Hegdesh? Well, if we're sanctified in Kli Shares, no. If we're sanctified in Kiddush Peh, yes. Shall we say that Rav Yoshia, when he spoke about this Mila, that we're not going to accept Hashaka if the Kiddush took place before the Hashaka, that's only with regard to a Kli Shares, Avol, but in the case of Kiddush B'Peh, then he would allow you to take the Mayim and subject it to Hashaka, because the Kiddush is on a lower level. It's not the real McCoy Kiddush. Oh, Dilma, B'Peh Nami, Ovid Rabbanan Milo. If something was sanctified B'Peh, then again, the Rabbanan uses Milo, and Hashaka is not going to be valid to be Matayr, that which was contaminated. Amalei Rav Dimi answers Abai. He says, Lo Shamati. I didn't hear this exact question, but Kayote Bashamati. I heard something similar, and therefore I think we can make an analogy. The Omer Rabbi Avo, Omer Rabbi Yochanan, Anovim Shenitmu, Derochan, the Achakach Ikdishon, Tahorim. The grapes themselves contracted Tumah, but the yayin inside the grapes are not Tmeim. This is Rabbi Yochanan's famous shita that we studied yesterday, that it's Mifkad Pakid. And now the question is, can we extract this yayin from Anovim Tmeim and use it on the Mizbeach for Nisach HaYayin? Says Rabbi Yochanan, yes, we can do it, but only in the following condition. If it was Drachan, the Acharkach Hekdishon, so at the moment that he pressed the grapes and removed the yayin, it was chulin, it was not yet kodesh, then we can say that at the point of dricha, when he did the pressing, tahorin, the yayin is considered tar. It's kosher in Nisach HaYayin. And even though these mashkim came from Anovim, and the Anovim themselves were Tmeim, but nevertheless, this Rabbi Yochanan, consistent with his opinion back on Daf Lamed Gimel of Mifkad Paki. But he could reach on the Achakach Drochan, if he was Magdish, he was Magdish the Yayin, and now he's doing the Dricha, then Tmeim. And this is going to be Maila Bekodshim. In other words, technically speaking, the Mayim, according to Rabbi Yochanan, that is Mechunasim, is not Tomei. And yet, because of Maila Bekodshim, we're going to consider it as if it's Tomei. Now, what does Rabbi Yochanan mean when he says Ikdishan v'achakach darchan tmein? He was magdish these grapes for the purpose of extracting the yayin and using it for nisach hamayim. There's no such thing as kli shares here. There is no kli shares. For anovim diktushas peninu, the only way that you can achieve your goal of being makadesh the grapes for purpose of nisach hayayin is through kiddush peh. And nevertheless, afilu hachi avid rabbanon maila bekodshim. And this maila means we're not going to consider them as if they were knusim, they were, inside the sack of the anovim, but rather we're going to consider them as if they're tmeim. So we see that the maila that the chachamim instituted in blocking or inhibiting the process of being mitar kodshim shenitmu applies even if that kiddush came through a peh and not through a kli. And the Gemara rejects it. Amar Rav Yosef, anovim ka'amrit. Rav Yochanan was talking about a mila of the chachamim in anovim. You can't bring a raya, can't prove anything from that case to our case of mayim, mayim for the nisach hamayim on Sukkos, because hacha, what was the case that Rabbi Yochanan was dealing with? He wasn't talking about hegdesh l'nesachim, but rather anovim shel truma askinon. When he used the word Rabbi Yochanan kedishon, what he had in mind, what he was mafresh them for truma, and kedushas peh didhu ki kedushas kli damya. Just like in Kodshim, we have Kedushas Kli, in order to engender Kedushas Truma, to be Mafresh Truma, we need Kedushas Peh, when he designates this Truma. Avalhani Deboy Kli, but in the case of Mayim, for Nisach HaMayim on the Chag, there we need a Kedushas Kli, in order to give it a Kedushas Guf L'Mizbeach, V'Peh Lo Ovid Rabbanim Mayil. It's quite possible, we don't know for sure, that if the kiddush of the mayim was just a kiddush peh, which is not enough, it's not sufficient for the mayim to lend themselves to nisach hamayim al gabi mizbeach, then in such a case, lo avid rabbanim maila, there is no maila. The Gemara now goes back to Rabbi Yochanan, and the Gemara asks the following kash. Rabbi Yochanan says that anovim shenitmu v'darchan tahorim, is darchan afilu tuva? Even if he does many grapes at the same time, how could that be? Why didn't Rabbi Yochanan qualify his statement? Mi Omer Rabbi Yochanan hachi, that he's allowed to take a large volume of grapes together at one time and press them, and the yayin that comes out will be tar. Omer Rabbi Yochanan, we had Rabbi Yochanan back on Daf Lamed Gimel, and anovim shenitmu darchan pachos mike beitza. How could Rabbi Yochanan just say the words drachan? That's not enough. He should say drachan pachos mike beitza. So the Gemara gives two answers. The first answer is a technical answer. Yibais ema hachanami pachos pachos mikabetza. Even though Rabbi Yochanan didn't qualify it, this is what he had in mind. Yibais ema. Now the Gemara gives a more fundamental answer, and that is hasam dinagu lahu berishon. Navi leinu sheni hacha dinagu b'sheni davalu shlishi. When Rabbi Yochanan spoke about the requirement of dricha of pachos mikam beitza, he was talking about anovim that came in contact with a rishon l'tumah. For example, if somebody has contact with a sheretz or a dead carcass, an avela, he becomes a rishon l'tumah, and now he came in contact with these grapes. The grapes now become a sheni l'tumah. And if the yayin comes out of these anovim, then we have a principle that nasa kayotze behen, that with regard to mashkin, when mashkim come in contact with a sheni l'tumah, they become a rishon l'tumah. And therefore, in order to avoid that, he has to make sure that it's a dricha of pachos mikam beitza. But hacha, here where Rabbi Yochanan did not qualify, he just said darchan, mashma even more than a kibetza, is the case is the nagu b'sheni, that these anovim came in contact with a sheni l'tuma, and if that be the case, the havi le shlishi l'tuma, the sheni that came in contact with the anovim makes the anovim into a shlishi l'tuma. Now in truma, shlishi cannot create a revi; it only becomes possible. So this yayin that comes out of the anovim, if the anovim are a sheni l'tuma, and the yayin is a shlishi l'tuma is not really tameh. It's only a psul truma. And therefore, Rabbi Yochanan will allow you to be dorech any volume whatsoever, and the yayin is considered tar. But if he was magdish the yayin, l'nisach hayayin, and then afterwards he does the dricha, then there's a Mila that the Chachamim made, and they consider the yayin as if it was tameh. It's like one entity with the anovim, and therefore it's pasul and mizbeh. Amar Rava afanan nami tnina. So again, we wanted to know, the Gemara was vacillating about Mila B'Kodshim. Does that apply even in the case of Kiddush Peh? And there was no Kiddush Kli. And the Gemara brings a number of proofs that even in this situation, even in this Metzius of Kiddush B'Peh, they made a Mila. And Rava is going to derive this from a Brisa. The Brisa addresses the parsha of Parah Duma, which of course is in Chukas, and the Afer, the ashes after they burn the parah, have to be added to mayim and made a concoction. That's called mechatos. The Torah says, "V'nasan alav mayim chayim el keli," that the Afer has to be placed into mayim chayim. And the brisa that Rava quotes darshans and derives from this pasuk of mayim chayim el keli, that shetehei chiyuson b'kli, that kli is the same kli that he was makadesh the mechatos. In other words, he takes mayim from a mayim, from a natural spring, and he puts the afer and creates the mechatos in that very kli. Shalo yamali b'kli echad v'yikadesh b'kli acher. He's not allowed to use two keli and use one keli to remove the mayim and another keli to mix with the ephah para and to sanctify it as mechatos. And now the question is the following. It says in the pasuk, v'nosan olav mayim chayim el keli. Alma tlushim ninu. The word v'nosan indicates that the mayim were already taken out of the mayon, and he's going to pour it into a second kli, and that's where the kiddush is going to take place. V'ha mechubarim ninhu, and the brisa requires mechubarim. How is that possible? The derivation and the ruling, the halacha that's formulated by this brisa is against the pshat and the pasuk. Ella, it must be maila. This is a maila in the mechatos that we need what's called mayim mechubarim. Mechubar means it's straight from the mayon. The Torah didn't require this. And when the Brisa quotes a pasuk, it's only an asmachta to give a certain extra teeth, so to speak, to the milah that the Rabbanon added over here. Now, we're not talking about Kedushas Kli here, because in fact, Mechatos has no Kedusha. So the status here of Kiddush is similar to Kiddush Peh. Because again, there is no Kiddush Kli in the case of Mechatos. I have here a footnote here. He writes, Ein Bahem Kiddusha Klal. Umiluyim L'Shem Mechatos Hu Ke'ein Kiddushas Peh. You just have to fill up the Kli with Mayim Chayim, and that's similar to Kedushas Peh. Hachinami here too, with regard to the two discussions that we had with Mechag, meaning the Mayim for Nisach HaMayim, or the case that we had of Truma, is the Chacham made a Maila, and they disregarded or invalidated Hashaka and Zriya, and that's the Maila that they did, even in the case of Kedushas Peh. Rav Shimi Bar Ashi Afanana Mitnina. I also have a Mishnah to prove that Maila Asu B'Kodshim, even in a case of Kedushas Peh. And the Mishnah in the 14th parak of Negoim speaks about a Tomei, Taval V'Ola. He went into the mikveh, he came up from the mikveh, Ochel B'Maisa Sheni, right? Although at full yom, it's not allowed to eat Kodshim or Truma, but he's allowed to eat Maisa Sheni. Maisa Sheni doesn't have the same level of Kedusha. Herev Shimsho, once the sun sets and the day of his tefillah has passed, he is completely tahar, Ochel B'Truma. Now he can eat Truma. So Rav Shimi is medayek from this Mishnah in Negoim that B'Truma in B'Kodshim Lo. That in a case of a Zav, Zova, Yoletis, and Mitzorah, they have to bring their kapara. So even though the sun sets, and that's called Herav Shimsho, they're allowed to eat Shruma, but they cannot eat Kodshim until they bring their kapara, until the very next morning, when each of these Tmeim, who are no longer Tmeim, will bring respectively their karbonos. Amai. So the Gemara asks, why can't they eat Kodshim? Taharhu. Ella Maila. This must be a Maila b'Kodshim. Hachinami. So too in Truma, Maila. That even though the Shtile Truma Shenitmu were planted in the ground, and therefore the Tumah is completely gone, the Mechubel Karka, but nevertheless, we're not allowed to eat it. It still has a status of Truma, and in this case, Truma Tmeya, because of the Maila of the Chachamim. Now, as far as Zava, and Yoletis is concerned, they have to bring that carbon in order to be mitayr themselves Tahara Gemura. And he says here in the footnote, Lo Hutzuchu Lilmod Kain Mikoch Diuk, Shari Mefurash Kain Viosa Mishnah, Shena Ochel Bekodshim Ad Shiyovi Kaparasa. Elakach Derech HaGemara L'dagdek B'tchilas HaMishnah. Okay, fine. Omar Avashi, Afanan Nami Tnina. I also have a brisa to teach us this Maila B'Kodesh, a special Maila, and this is regarding Basa Kodesh and Nitma. The Torah says in Vayikra Zion, "V'abasar asher yiga b'chol tomei lo ye'ochel ba'eshi sarev ve'abasar kol tar yochal basar." Now, there's an extra vav in the word ve'habasar. L'rabos es ha'etzim v'alavona, that if the etzim for the marach of the mizbeach or the lavona that's used for the bringing of the korban mincha became tameh, we cannot allow them. They're totally disqualified from the mikdash, even though they are included under asher yiga b'chol tameh v'lo yochal ba'esh tisarek. Wait a minute. We know that ochlin or mashkim can be makabel tumah, but eitzim and lavona, b'nei etmuyeininu, can they be makabel tumah? It's not an ochel. Elo maila miyuchedes. It must be a special maila with regard to kodshim. Is hachinami here too in the case of truma, which also is like kodesh. The chacham made a maila, and sile truma shenizru, which are tahorim. Nevertheless, they made a maila, and they considered it as if it was truma tmeya, and you're not allowed to eat them. And this is where we're going to stop. From B'li Neder, if I get a chance, I will try to learn this Mishnah, because now we're getting back into Pesachim. This is the main Mishnah of matzah. What exactly is matzah, what it's made out of, and so forth. I'll take this opportunity to wish you all a Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much. And have a meaningful fast.